The Old West you learned about in school is not the Old West that actually happened. The real frontier had camels marching through the Arizona desert, a judge who used a beer bottle as his gavel, and a wagon train that turned to cannibalism just to survive a single winter. These are 30 facts so strange, so uncomfortable, that most textbooks simply left them out. Number 30 explains why the frontier didn't end with a gunfight at all. Number 1, the United States Army once tried to win the West with camels. In 1856, the War Department shipped over 70 camels from the Middle East to Texas, betting that they could outlast horses in the desert heat. And they were right. The camels crossed brutal stretches of Arizona and California without water for days, carried heavier loads, and barely complained. But soldiers hated them. They spooked the horses, smelled terrible, and bit anyone who got close. When the Civil War broke out, the program was abandoned and the camels were simply released into the desert. Wild camel sightings were reported in the Southwest for decades afterward, spooking prospectors who swore they were seeing ghosts. The last confirmed sighting of a wild camel roaming free in Arizona wasn't until 1941, nearly 80 years after the program was scrapped, proof that some experiments never fully leave the desert they were abandoned in. Number 2, an entire boomtown was built illegally on land that wasn't America's to give away. Deadwood, South Dakota, exploded into existence in 1876 after gold was found in the Black Hills. There was one enormous problem. The Black Hills belonged to the Lakota Sioux under a signed federal treaty. The government knew it, the prospectors knew it, and they poured in anyway. Within a year, 10,000 people were living in a town that legally shouldn't have existed. The broken treaty triggered the Great Sioux War, and it took the government less than 3 years to simply rewrite the map and seize the land outright. Deadwood's gold built fortunes. The theft that made it possible barely gets a footnote. In 1980, the Supreme Court finally agreed the seizure had been illegal and ordered compensation. The Sioux Nation refused the money, which still sits in a federal account today, now worth well over $1 billion, because taking the payment would mean legally accepting the land was gone for good. Number 3, one man appointed himself judge, jury, and bartender all at once, and nobody could stop him. Judge Roy Bean ran the only law for hundreds of miles in the Texas border town of Langtree. His courtroom was his saloon. His law book was a single outdated statute from 1879 that he refused to update for 20 years. He fined dead bodies found with cash in their pockets, pocketing the money as a corpse processing fee. He once released a man charged with killing a Chinese laborer because, in his words, he couldn't find a law against it. There was no appeal. There was no other judge. West of the Pecos River, Roy Bean simply was the law. He also refused to hang a horse thief once, not out of mercy, but because he decided the county couldn't spare the cost of the rope. Number 4, frontier doctors were selling children medicine that contained real opium, and it was completely legal. Long before anyone understood addiction the way we do now, pharmacies across the West stocked syrups with names like Soothing Cordial and Mother's Friend. Read the label today, and the first ingredient is often morphine or laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol. Mothers gave it to teething infants to stop the crying. It worked because the baby wasn't calm, it was sedated. Infant deaths from these medicines were common enough that some doctors quietly warned against them, but there was no regulation to back them up. The wild frontier wasn't just guns and outlaws. It was a pharmacy with no rules at all. It took until 1906 and a federal Pure Food and Drug Act before manufacturers were even required to list opium or morphine on the label at all. Number 5, the most famous outlaw in American history was turned into a folk hero by writers who had never met him. Jesse James robbed banks and trains and killed without hesitation. Yet within a few years of his death, dime novelists had rebuilt him into a Robin Hood figure who stole from the rich to help the poor. There is no solid historical evidence he ever gave a cent to anyone in need. What he did have was a sympathetic newspaper editor, John Newman Edwards, who published glowing editorials comparing James to a Confederate knight fighting against Northern bankers. The legend outlived the truth so completely that when James was finally shot in 1882, crowds treated his funeral like a hero's farewell. His own killer, a gang member named Robert Ford, chasing a reward, spent the rest of his life being booed on stage for reenacting the murder because the audience had already decided who the real villain was. Number 6, the very first rodeo wasn't a show. It was 2 bored ranch crews settling an argument. In 1869, cowhands from rival outfits in Deer Trail, Colorado got into a dispute about who had the better cattle handling skills. Instead of a fistfight, they staged an impromptu roping and riding contest with real cattle and no safety equipment of any kind. Word spread, other ranches wanted in, and within 20 years, towns across the plains were hosting organized rodeos as actual tourist attractions. The events we now watch as polished sport, bull riding, calf roping, bronc busting, were originally just the daily dangerous work of a cattle ranch turned into a public bet. Nobody in Deer Trail that day thought they were founding a sport that would one day fill stadiums and pay champions 6-figure prize money. Number 7, women could vote in the Wild West half a century before the rest of the country caught up. In 1869, the Wyoming Territory granted women full voting rights, making it the first place in the modern world to do so. The motive wasn't purely idealistic. Wyoming had roughly 6 men for every woman, and territorial leaders hoped suffrage would attract more women to settle there and boost the population enough to qualify for statehood. It worked on both fronts. Women voted, served on juries, and held office decades before the 19th Amendment. When Wyoming applied for statehood in 1890, Congress threatened to reject it unless women's suffrage was repealed. Wyoming's answer was blunt. They said they would rather stay a territory for 100 years than take the vote away from their women. Congress backed down. Wyoming became the 44th state, and it entered the Union carrying the nickname it still uses proudly today, the Equality State. Number 8, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show made Sitting Bull famous and paid him more than most white performers, and it still destroyed him. After the Lakota leader defeated Custer at Little Bighorn, he spent years as a symbol of resistance. Then in 1885, he joined Buffalo Bill Cody's traveling show, riding once around the arena each night while crowds booed the man who killed Custer. He earned $50 a week, an enormous sum at the time, and reportedly gave most of it away to beggars he saw on the street. Confused by how much poverty he found in wealthy cities, he left the show after 4 months, uncomfortable with being paraded as a villain for entertainment. Buffalo Bill later begged federal agents not to arrest him, sensing exactly how it would end. 5 years later, he was killed during a raid meant to arrest him at Standing Rock. Number 9, some of the most feared outlaw gangs never actually used dynamite. They used bluff and reputation instead. Robbing a bank vault with real nitroglycerin was dangerous and unreliable, so plenty of gangs skipped it entirely. They would toss an ordinary stick wrapped to look like dynamite onto the counter, scream a countdown, and let fear do the rest. Bank tellers, who had heard the stories just like everyone else, usually opened the vault without checking. Sheriffs and newspapers loved reporting explosive heists because it made a better story. So the myth of West-wide dynamite robberies grew far larger than the actual number of times anyone lit a real fuse. In more than one recorded case, the gang fled with an empty vault simply because the frightened teller handed over nothing but excuses, and nobody ever checked whether the box on the counter could even explode. Number 10, an entire category of cemetery got its nickname from how violently people ended up in it. Boot Hill became the informal name for burial grounds across dozens of frontier towns, and the reason was blunt. Men buried there had usually died suddenly, often shot, and were laid to rest still wearing their boots because nobody had time or reason for a proper burial ritual. Tombstone's Boot Hill alone holds over 250 graves, many marked with nothing but a wooden cross reading a first name and the word unknown. Looking at the headstones today, the causes of death read like a checklist of frontier violence: shot in a duel, hanged for horse theft, killed in a claim dispute. Number 11, going to the dentist in a frontier town could genuinely be more dangerous than getting shot. Formal dental schools barely existed west of the Mississippi, so the job usually fell to the local barber, who already owned sharp tools and a chair. There was no anesthesia beyond whiskey, no sterilization beyond wiping a blade on a cloth, and no guarantee the same razor hadn't been used for a shave an hour earlier. Infection from a tooth extraction killed more frontier residents than most people realize, quietly, slowly, without the drama of a shootout, which is exactly why it never made it into the movies. There is no dramatic music for a man dying slowly of blood poisoning 3 weeks after a haircut. Number 12, thousands of frontier marriages started as a business transaction placed in a newspaper. Matrimonial papers with names like the Matrimonial News circulated across the West, printing short advertisements from lonely settlers and equally lonely women back east looking for a fresh start. A rancher might describe his acreage and cattle count instead of his personality. A woman might list her cooking skills and church attendance. Letters went back and forth for months before either party ever saw a photograph. Many of these arrangements collapsed within days of the bride actually stepping off the train and meeting a stranger who looked nothing like his letters described. Some, against all odds, lasted for 50 years. Number 13, there was an unwritten code among frontier gunmen, and the most famous names in Western history broke it constantly. The so-called Code of the West supposedly demanded a face-to-face confrontation. Never shoot a man in the back, never draw on an unarmed opponent. In reality, Jesse James was shot in the back of the head by a member of his own gang chasing a reward. Wild Bill Hickok himself was killed from behind while playing cards. The code made for a compelling legend, honor among outlaws, but the actual death records of the era tell a much less noble story, one built on ambush, betrayal, and whoever could pull the trigger first. Number 14, roughly 1 in 4 working cowboys was black, and Hollywood spent a century erasing them from the picture. After the Civil War, thousands of formerly enslaved men headed west, where cattle work offered something rare, a wage and a measure of independence regardless of race. Men like Bose Icard and Bill Pickett became legends within the industry, with Pickett credited as the inventor of bulldogging, the technique of wrestling a steer to the ground by its horns that still anchors rodeo today. Yet by the time Western films exploded in popularity in the 20th century, almost every cowboy on screen was white. An entire demographic that built the cattle industry with their hands was quietly written out of its own story. Number 15, settlers on the treeless plains built houses out of the dirt itself, and sometimes the roof came alive. With no lumber for hundreds of miles, homesteaders cut thick bricks of prairie sod, packed with dense root systems, and stacked them into walls and roofs. These sod houses, nicknamed soddies, were surprisingly good insulation against brutal winters and scorching summers. They also came with an unshakable downside. Snakes, insects, and even the occasional small rodent lived inside the packed dirt roof and would occasionally fall through onto the dinner table below. Settlers wrote in diaries about waking up to find a snake curled on the blanket, having simply dropped down from the ceiling overnight. Number 16, wanted outlaws quietly recruited new gang members through coded newspaper advertisements hidden among ordinary classifieds. Certain phrases, oddly specific job descriptions, or unusual contact instructions signaled to the right reader that this wasn't really a farmhand posting. A man looking for work who understood the code could respond and end up riding with a gang within weeks. Lawmen eventually caught on to a handful of these patterns, but newspapers rarely had the resources to screen every small print advertisement running in their pages, and by the time a coded ad was identified, the gang had usually already moved on to the next town. Number 17, the biggest crime on the open range wasn't robbery. It was rewriting a cow's ownership with a hot iron. Cattle rustlers didn't need to steal an animal outright when they could simply alter the brand burned into its hide, a practice called brand blotting. A skilled rustler could turn one ranch's symbol into another with a few careful lines. This quiet, slow-motion theft escalated tensions across cattle country for years and eventually exploded into the Johnson County War of 1892 in Wyoming, when large cattle barons hired gunmen to hunt down suspected rustlers, resulting in an armed standoff that required the United States cavalry to step in and stop a private war from spiraling further out of control. Number 18. One invention ended the open range almost overnight, and ranchers went to actual war over it. Barbed wire, patented in 1874, let settlers fence off land cheaply for the first time in frontier history. Cattle ranchers, who relied on open grazing across unfenced territory, suddenly found their traditional routes blocked by homesteaders exercising their legal right to fence their own claims. The response, in more than one region, was organized sabotage. Gangs rode out at night with wire cutters, destroying fences by the mile in what became known as the fence-cutting wars. Texas eventually made fence-cutting a felony, but by then barbed wire had already redrawn the entire economic map of the West. Number 19, in some frontier towns, saloons outnumbered every other type of business combined. Certain boomtowns during peak mining years reportedly had one saloon for every 100 residents or fewer, meaning a town of 2,000 people might support 20 or more drinking establishments simultaneously. This wasn't simply about thirst. Saloons doubled as banks, courtrooms, post offices, and the only heated public building in town during brutal winters. When a settlement's economy collapsed, usually because the mine ran dry, the saloons were often the very last businesses standing, propped up by men with nowhere else to be and nothing left to lose. Number 20. Grieving families paid a small fortune to have a photograph taken of a loved one who had already died. Post-mortem photography was common practice across the frontier, where a formal portrait was often the only image a family would ever have of a child or relative. Traveling photographers posed the deceased sitting upright in a chair, sometimes with eyes carefully propped open, surrounded by living family members standing stiffly beside them. To modernize, the practice looks disturbing. At the time, with death arriving suddenly and photography still a luxury, it was often the only chance a family got to hold onto a face before it was gone forever. Number 21. The legend of the lightning-fast, quick draw gunfight was largely built by one man talking about himself. Wild Bill Hickok gave a string of newspaper interviews in the years before his death, describing his own gunfights in increasingly dramatic detail, embellishing draw speeds and kill counts that historians later found difficult to verify against actual records. Eastern journalists, hungry for frontier content to sell papers, printed his stories without much scrutiny. The image cemented itself so firmly in the public imagination that by the time Hollywood arrived decades later, the exaggerated version had simply become accepted fact, repeated in film after film as though it had always been history rather than self-promotion. Number 22. Some of the wealthiest business owners on the frontier were women running the brothels everyone pretended not to notice. Prostitution was widespread and, in many boomtowns, quietly tolerated by local government because of the tax revenue and business it generated. A handful of madams built genuine fortunes. Maddie Silks in Denver ran a highly profitable operation for decades, invested her earnings in real estate, and outlived most of the men who tried to control the industry around her. These women existed in a strange social position, publicly shunned, privately essential to a town's economy, wealthy enough to influence local politics while still being denied basic respectability by the same society that depended on them. Number 23. An entire branch of the United States cavalry was named by the very people it was sent to fight, and the soldiers wore the name with pride. Black cavalry regiments, formed after the Civil War, patrolled the frontier fighting Native American resistance, escorting settlers and building roads. Native fighters gave them the nickname Buffalo Soldiers, reportedly because of their dark, curly hair resembling a buffalo's coat and their fierce reputation in combat. Rather than rejecting the name, the regiments embraced it, and the buffalo eventually appeared on their own regimental crest. It remains one of the stranger footnotes of the era, a nickname born from the enemy becoming a badge of honor. Number 24. Entire towns organized mobs to hang men without ever holding a trial, and largely got away with it. Vigilance committees formed across the West whenever residents decided the official legal system was too slow or too corrupt to trust. The San Francisco Vigilance Committee of 1856 grew to include thousands of armed members who arrested, tried in their own private court, and executed men accused of crimes, all completely outside the actual justice system. City officials, terrified of the committee's size and public support, mostly stood aside and let it happen. Vigilante hangings became such a routine feature of frontier life that some newspapers reported them with barely more detail than a weather update. Number 25. Traveling salesmen went door to door selling literal snake oil, and it usually contained no snake at all. The term snake oil salesman exists today because of real peddlers who rolled into frontier towns selling tonics that promised to cure everything from arthritis to baldness. Independent testing decades later found that many of these products contained little more than mineral oil, alcohol, and cheap flavoring, with zero medicinal ingredients of any kind. Salesmen relied on a rehearsed pitch, a captive audience with limited access to real doctors, and a fast getaway before customers realized the tonic hadn't worked. By the time regulation caught up with the practice, the phrase itself had already become permanent slang for a con. Number 26. One wagon train's shortcut turned into one of the darkest survival stories in American history. In 1846, the Donner Party, a group of pioneer families heading to California, took an unproven shortcut that cost them precious weeks and left them trapped by early, brutal snowfall in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Supplies ran out completely. Of the roughly 87 people trapped, nearly half died from starvation and exposure over that winter, and multiple survivor accounts confirmed that some of the dead were eaten by the living in a desperate attempt to survive until rescue parties finally arrived the following spring. It remains one of the most studied and most horrifying chapters of westward migration. Number 27. The government handed out free land, and thousands of people cheated the system before it even officially opened. The Homestead Act promised settlers ownership of a plot of land if they lived on it and improved it for 5 years, and fraud followed almost immediately. Some claimants built a tiny, barely livable shack just large enough to technically satisfy the law, never actually farming the land at all. During the famous Oklahoma land rush of 1889, so many people illegally snuck across the starting line before the official signal that the state's nickname, the Sooner State, comes directly from the cheaters who jumped the gun to grab the best land first. Number 28. The last real gunfights of the Old West didn't happen in the 1800s at all. They stretched into the 1920s along the remote border regions of New Mexico and Arizona, where ranching disputes, bootlegging during Prohibition, and lingering feuds kept frontier-style violence alive decades after the era was supposed to be over. Lawmen in these regions still occasionally rode horseback rather than drove, and shootouts over cattle and land continued in isolated pockets, long after skyscrapers had already risen in eastern cities. The Old West didn't have a single closing date. It simply faded unevenly, disappearing from some places years before it finally let go of others. Number 29. The frontier arguably ended not with a gunfight, but with a government report nobody outside a census office ever expected to matter. In 1890, the United States Census Bureau announced that the country's population had spread so evenly across the map that there was no longer a clear, identifiable frontier line left to draw. A historian named Frederick Jackson Turner read that single bureaucratic sentence and built an entire influential theory around it, arguing that the frontier had shaped the very character of the American identity, and that its disappearance marked the true end of an era. A dry government statistic quietly closed a chapter that thousands of gunfights, cattle drives, and gold rushes never managed to close on their own. Number 30, this is the one that changes how you should think about everything before it. The Old West didn't die from a bullet at all. It died from a price tag. The automobile, mass-produced and increasingly affordable through the early 1900s, made the horse obsolete as basic transportation within a single generation. Fences went up faster than outlaws could cut them down. Telephone lines, railroads, and eventually paved roads connected towns that had once been isolated enough to make their own rules. The last working cowboys didn't get shot off their horses in a final showdown. They simply got outcompeted by a machine that didn't need to be fed, didn't spook, and never once reached for a gun. The frontier wasn't conquered. It was upgraded quietly, filed away, and forgotten.